Firstly, many thanks to Redim Brazil for inviting me to give this keynote lecture today, especially to Pablo Sotoyo Blanco and Paulo Kuhl at Unicamp, strategic partner of Cardiff University. I'm very sorry not to be with you, as I was in Salvador da Bahia for the Redim Brazil conference 10 years ago already, but I'm looking forward to receiving a visit from Professor Kuhl in Cardiff as soon as travel restrictions will allow. Thank you to all those who made this conference possible online, and I look forward to the live Q&A session tomorrow. The Carmen Abroad project grew from an international conference in 2017 to trace the performance history of Bizet's opera around the globe, and which elucidated the networks of exchange and influence from its Parisian premiere in 1875 up until the Second World War. Many issues emerged during the various papers given, and still more in the fruitful discussions which followed, which revealed a multitude of performance traditions, narratives, and modes of storytelling, which were adapted and reconfigured in different geopolitical situations and social and artistic contexts. At the same time, papers and later chapters demonstrated how scores, singers, performers, sets, theatrical conventions, and audience receptions crossed national boundaries. These revelations led us to question many of our assumptions about what we thought we knew about Carmen and its performance history, or to probe exactly what we didn't know in the hope of finding answers. Perhaps an easy way into this paper is to give you straight away some concrete examples of new information uncovered in our resulting edited collection published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. So everyone knows that Carmen was a flop at its premiere in Paris in 1875, right? Well, despite nuanced readings of the Parisian press by Leslie Wright and Hervé Lecombe, this image still remains. Yet, the opera was performed 48 times within its first 12-month run at the Opéra Comique, so hardly a disaster, even if the press following the premiere reported upon a scandalous novella, inept for theatrical adaptation, a difficult and complex score which trampled audience and critics' expectations, and a beautiful staging simultaneously augmented and disgraced by an all too realistic performance from the first Carmen, Célestine Galli-Marié. With regard to 21st century productions concerned with reading Carmen in the light of violence against women, other assumptions have been made. In a recent programme note, I have seen misquoted Théodore de Banville's highly elogious review, where he refers to Bizet's daring modernity as laying siege to the Opéra Comique, to suggest that it was in fact Carmen's overt sexuality that had violated the Opéra Comique. Thus, poetic language of the 19th century is extrapolated into a contemporary context to suggest that Carmen was indeed a flop, and for one reason alone, its explicit portrayal of female sexuality. Yet Anglo-American scholarship can be rife with assumptions also. One relatively recent book affirms that there were no performances of Carmen in France between 1876 and 1883, and thus the French completely ignored the masterpiece of operatic literature they had on their hands. Okay, so if you substitute Paris for France in this statement, it is not incorrect. But my own research has revealed over 400 performances in runs of more than 3 performances in regional metropolitan France between February 1876 and May 1883. And the press reception in the regions reveals that the national acceptance and recognition of Carmen went hand in hand with the international one, which was only one contributing factor to the opera's revival in Paris in 1883. With regard to staging, costume and design, many fascinating points emerged. The lack of any attribution for the scenery design in any Parisian Carmen review in 1875 or in the original published scores, contrary to custom, is troubling, as it appears no definitive answer can be given as to who designed the sets for Carmen. Yet, collaborative work has nuanced our understanding. By now, Evan Baker's 1990 affirmation that Auguste Lamy was the set designer for the original production has been discredited. Auguste Lamy was an illustrator, that is to say, a graphic artist accustomed to working in 2 dimensions, not a designer equipped with the necessary skills, even if his illustrations correspond to floor plans of early staging books. Lamy's job was to provide Choudin's, Bizet's publisher, and their clients with plates of the Opéra Comique staging created by scenic artists. He already done and would go on to do the same thing for Thomas Mignon in 1866 after designs by Auguste Alfred Rubé, for Offenbach's Les Contes d'Hoffmann and Gounod's Le Tribut de Zamora, both in 1881. In 2005, Nicole Wild and David Charlton affirmed that the original scenery was by Émile Daran, Marcel Jambon and Alexandre Bailly. However, Bailly was 9 years old in 1875, while his future associate Marcel Jambon had yet to establish himself as an independent designer. In 1875, Jambon was still learning the ropes under the guidance of Rubé and Chaperon, only going it alone in 1889. Émile Daran is a more likely candidate, as there survives an undated model by him for the 4th act of Carmen at the Bibliothèque Musée de l'Opéra in Paris. Daran came from the studio of Fillastre and Cambon, becoming renowned from the 1850s, his name figuring among the original decorators of Faust in 1859, and he was associated with the Opéra Comique, and the Théâtre de la Monnaie in Brussels during the 1870s. And yet research for the first revival of Carmen at the Vienna Court Opera in October 1875 has thrown the name of Victor Duvigneau into the mix. The Viennese designs were made by the firm Brioschi, Burkhardt and Kautsky, as documented in the so-called Brioschi albums, where each design is supplied with a construction plan indicating how the set is built on stage. Compared to other surviving designs of early Carmen stagings in Europe, the Brioschis are strikingly grandiose. Indeed, the monumental full-scale facade for Act 4 looks more like a Roman amphitheatre than a civilian arena, offering a strikingly unusual backdrop to the final scene. Yet theatre director and German translator of Carmen, Franz Jauner, received a direct offer from the French decorator Duvigneau for models of the Parisian sets for Carmen, which he curtly declined. How did Duvigneau possess models of the Carmen scenery? He designed for the 1874 Opéra Comique production of Thomas Gilles et Gilotti, and was a skilled designer, serving as peintre de l'administration to the Comédie Française from 1872 until at least 1882, designing, among others, the revival of Victor Hugo's Le Roi s'amuse in 1882, and executing a set of models for the 1878 Exposition Universelle under the Comédie Française's director, Émile Perrin. Did Duvigneau's official function at the Comédie Française perhaps prevent him from publicly disclosing his authorship of the Carmen scenery? This seems unlikely, as few, if any, decorators in Paris worked in exclusivity. But could it be that Duvigneau turned Lamy's or even someone else's drawings into 3-dimensional sets, the authorship of which he could not claim? Knowledge of these sorts of borrowings and transfers arose from the collaborative research and pooled resources of over 20 academics, who were keen not only to share among themselves, but also more widely by creating a global map and timeline of Carmen performances, so that their research data could be readily available to a wide public in an appealing format, which not only spoke about Carmen, but also about the transnational journeys the opera made. I wish to say immediately that this paper may have been put together by me, but it draws heavily on the research of my collaborators, as well as the sterling work of my research and website assistant, Henry Morgan, to whom I am eternally grateful. I apologise also for what feels somewhat counterintuitive, that when expounding the virtues of an interactive and experiential website, I'm actually showing you screenshots of it rather than working the tools. In a live paper with a good internet connection, I would have done just that, but it was easier to incorporate into a recorded presentation in the form of slides. So while the co-edited volume examines specific examples of the cultural entanglements and complex interconnections which arose, providing specific understandings of localization and glocalization, emphasizing the diversity and a multi-local production of opera, the website tries to do something a little different. First, it acts as a repository for many more images and archival documents in original languages and translations than could be accommodated in the published book. For example, while the original staging book has been recently made available digitally by the web pages of the Parisian Bibliothèque Patrimoniale, Carmen Abroad hosts not only a PDF of the original, but also an English translation with an explanatory introduction by Richard Langham Smith. In addition, the website provides references and source information, as well as a link to a comprehensive and collaboratively constructed bibliography. With the aim of a level of sustainability beyond the end of our grant period, the website also has an essays page where collaborators can publish short essays on anything Carmen related. This part of the website in particular continues to grow, and I am welcome to any offers of interesting articles on Carmen around the world. Such essays serve as important contextual material for the data which underpins the map and timeline, and also plugs gaps in our knowledge beyond that present in the book, whether those gaps be geographical, institutional, political, or indeed performance related. In addition, the essays nurture interest and build a cross-generational research network and community among younger international scholars who are happy to share research data in return for a short online publication and a personal profile as a collaborator on a digital project of international reach. And this is just a selection you can see here of some of our collaborators. In an era, however, where the success of the digital humanities begins to be called into question, we still managed to secure small-scale funding, first from Cardiff University, followed by the British Academy Leverhulme Trust, to create a resource which is underpinned by a huge collaboratively compiled and continually growing dataset of currently about 1,000 performance runs of the opera, from Tokyo to Rio de Janeiro, from Helsinki to Melbourne, from Algiers to New Orleans. And this idea of a performance run I will come back to in a minute. The convergence of diverse and collaboratively collected source materials embodying Pierre Lévy's concept of the emergent collective intelligence available to us in the age of networked digital technology, nevertheless brought with it a huge variety of data. The taxonomizing, integration, and clear representation of that thick or big data set has been a daunting task, but one that is hoped can generate new types of questions and present new opportunities for inquiry. CarmenAbroad.org thus started via a conventional musicological conference where delegates were naturally and through shared academic knowledge, research and dissemination methods all linking up performances around the world, chronologically, teleologically, but also transversally and transnationally as historians in the humanities do. Yet the lure of the digital humanities was in the back of everyone's mind, and its more recent spatial turn, added to a growing body of work on musical geography and musical mapping, alongside increasingly widespread technological capabilities, were beckoning to even the most dinosaur among us, like a golden compass through which we might enhance our view, and hence our thinking, understanding, and analysis. Unlike for some, the digital humanities in no way circumscribed or constrained our project, but provided us with an opportunity to do something more, which happily chimed with both my research and what is called in the UK the impact case study I was then beginning to write on the range of my work on Carmen in collaboration with Richard Langham Smith. The frequently reiterated affirmation that a digital platform and analysis can enhance societal impact was never part of our thinking. We were not that naive. Nevertheless, it could constitute what in the UK we term a pathway to impact, alongside all sorts of more traditional activities such as performance workshops and consultancies, public engagement events, and performances of Carmen using the Peters Edition vocal score, edited by Richard Langham Smith and me. In addition, as just mentioned, the website provided visibility of the wider project from the book and all that followed, allowing publication of everything from articles to interviews to survey reports. Thus, like others before us, we turn to mapping as a way of instrumentalizing research data in a visually appealing way, maximizing the potential of interactive maps for displaying relationships between geographical and historical data to create an enlightening, modern, and user-friendly experience for a diverse public. For us musicologists, we wanted this tool to help us tell new stories as a means for analysis, organisation, and presentation of our research. Fueled by the increasing accessibility of Geographic Information Systems, GIS software, our map was born. And the possibility of a timeline which worked diachronically with the map exploded our musicological brains and opened up a world of possibilities we had never explored. The integrated map and timeline thus afford complex movement through the data, allowing us to visualise and analyse complicated trends across time and place with relative ease. The large dataset, combined with the possibilities afforded by multidimensional digital space for the representation and analysis of the performance of Carmen, aims to create a tool for both detecting broader trends and stimulating close and contextualized readings, many of which can be found in the accompanying book. A transnational approach to the work of a single author or authorial team nevertheless highlights a tension that underpins both the book and mapping endeavours. Generally, transnational analyses tend to eliminate the concept of an original work or its conceptual origin point in an attempt at, and I quote, decolonising cultural studies. The notion of cultural mobility and transnational dialogue between different regions and cultures, which waives the complex hierarchies of centre and periphery in favour of a broader notion of cultural exchange, offers an attractive framework within which to analyse Carmen's cultural capital as a global phenomenon. Yet there is an assumption that European art forms remain, if not universally applicable, then highly adaptable, laying claim to the highest level of authority and prestige. Thus, any post-colonial transnational study of Carmen needs to highlight such asymmetries and relations of power rather than some unified cosmopolitanism, both within the old world and between the old and the new worlds. By moving away from and problematizing narratives of exchange which foreground axes of foreign versus native or original versus copy, we can attempt to achieve a more appropriate transnational methodology. Two chapters in particular in the book succeeded in such sophisticated analyses that foregrounded the ways in which Carmen could be consumed, appropriated and appreciated by audiences in Spanish America and in Japan. As a French opéra comique, both similar in some ways and very different in others to Zarzuela, situated in an imagined Spain, whose most famous aria was in the popular genre of a habanera, Carmen was an extremely complex cultural object for audiences in Spanish America during a period when links with the motherland were being both loosened and then strengthened again thanks to regained cultural and commercial links. As José Manuel Izquierdo, Jaime Cortés Polonia and Juan Francisco Sanz have shown, Mexican audiences appreciated Carmen for its poetic illusion of Spain, disliking the Spanish adaptations of it, which, in the name of authenticity, merely deformed the original work. Originally written by the Basque composer Sebastián Iradier, in an era of the Andalusicization of Spanish culture, the habanera was necessarily seen as something that exceeded Spanish culture and that felt like an extension of well-established local traditions. And yet the habanera form was defined in 1867 as a combination of the ubiquitous danza and African dance due to the accompaniment based on the African tango rhythm, which brought with it racist associations of licentiousness. Used by Bizet to create a feeling of exoticism, eroticism and otherness, the habanera was more likely in Spanish America to create feelings of familiarity and even legitimization. In Japan, the issues of race, class, ethnicity and gender, that is to say Carmen's otherness, were completely lost in a society which even today remains 98% ethnically Japanese. As Naomi Matsumoto has shown, while the erotic elements were plain for all to see, the Japanese never perceived Carmen as belonging to a subordinate, ethnically distinct and corrupting other, a view typically projected, moreover, the other way round, from the West to the Far East. Carmen was seen merely as a typical Spanish woman, and by extension, Western Caucasian woman. And amusingly, even deeper confusion arose when a newspaper columnist in 1919 referred to Carmen as Czech through a mistranslation of the French bohémienne, or gypsy. The cover image of our book, which you saw at the start of this presentation, is the cover engraving of the first published vocal score of the habanera in Japan in 1919. Yumeji Takahisa. It embodied to us visually, in a highly attractive image, the processes of adaptation and translation at the heart of the stories we wanted to tell. From the Western perspective, this Carmen may look quintessentially Japanese, but to the Japanese at the time, her warm, languorous eyes decorated with long lashes and her parted crimson lips were taken to be overtly sexual and hence alien. Following the first performances of the whole opera in Japan by a Russian touring company, again in 1919, and with the issues of race and ethnicity in mind, it is notable that it was two mixed-race singers, the tenor Yoshi Fujiwara and the mezzo Yoshiko Sato, who were instrumental in disseminating the popularity of Carmen in Japan during the 1920s and 1930s. Moreover, that the 1935 adaptation by Kozaku Yamada was based on Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko's 1924 Soviet adaptation Carmencita and the Soldier shows just how far ideologically from the Parisian operatic point of origin that these Japanese performances had travelled. And both examples cited admirably demonstrate the complexity of the flows of cultural travel. But back to the website and to maps. Dennis Wood reminds us that maps are performative, political artefacts with ritualistic functions, called into being, and I quote, to perform the state. Thus, in creating a Carmen map or various historical geopolitical maps, are we perpetuating a colonial and outdated model that is antinomical to the modern transnational study of culture? In addition, the presence of a timeline encourages an approach which hierarchizes performances as Carmen number 1, Carmen number 2, etc. The tension of this unhappy juxtaposition, which could be seen to negate the multidirectional cultural flows, lurks, therefore, not only behind the transnational analysis, but also in the visual representation of the digital map and timeline. Moreover, if the technology used to create the map and timeline is based on software such as Google Maps, which is in itself based on the affordances, assumptions and ideologies of standardised, westernised cultural practices, are we not shooting ourselves and our study in the foot? If transnational studies aim to highlight the asymmetries of power and production in a post-colonial reading of cultural exchange, we need to be upfront and transparent not only about the strategic and pragmatic decisions on which our maps are built, but also, and this is much harder, to deconstruct these most ubiquitous of knowledge platforms, to strategically and systematically create fault lines and fissures in them to enable a multiplicity of storytelling maps that foreground alternative histories rather than smooth over the apparently seamless expansionist flows of colonial and neoliberal capitalism. With the book and website, therefore, we aimed to engage intensively with a large number of different stories, which circulate back and forth between different national and regional traditions and cultures of opera, and which probe the causes and consequences of those exchanges. The ways in which we do this with regard to the website are less obvious, and while the digital humanities attempt to rethink the media in which cultural criticism and historical investigations are undertaken, we perhaps still have some way to go. In its present form, our database that underpins the map and timeline is divided into around, as I said, 1,000 discrete packets of information or performance runs, a number of performances in the same house in the same season, each corresponding to an individual point on the map. As with a number of major decisions in the construction of the site, this somewhat unwieldy notion of performance run arose from the nature of our dataset itself and as something of a compromise. In our ongoing data collection process, while we gave our contributors some guidelines in terms of what information was most important to us, we were keen for them to give us whatever data they had collected or had access to for their own particular purposes. This allowed the data set itself to shape the fundamental structure of the database as it was being built, with an ever-evolving set of main categories uncovering new narratives and affording the site new potentialities with each addition. There are clear advantages to this largely self-shaping dataset, but the task of taxonomizing and clearly representing the data has proven challenging. The information offered to us was often thick but highly inconsistent in its specific content. And indeed, this process of creating a map and the dataset that underpins it has led to new investigations into ways of recovering historical data, as well as bringing new researchers on board where geographical gaps in primary source materials were clearly revealed. Many people were able to provide us with a year, a venue, and a specific number of performances, but in most of these cases it made very little sense to separate each performance into its own data point, especially as we were not always sure of specific dates. Our solution to this problem came in the form of these so-called performance runs, a context-specific way of dividing up our database that essentially allowed us to widen the axes to accommodate the thickest points in our data, but also to collapse back down in the thinner places to avoid the yawning gaps or speculation that would arise from attempting to separate out too many individual performances or the overwhelming clutter and information density of the opposing approach. We have therefore ended up with a map that is somewhat capable of displaying long-running productions in a single location, such as director Albert Carré's new production at the Opéra Comique in 1898, which ran with few modifications right through until the 1970s. Moreover, through the use of hierarchies or parent-child relationships between individual performance runs in the dataset, alongside a keyword search specific to the map, it can visualize the travels of touring or visiting productions that never stay still for long, such as those organised by impresario Max Strakos in North America, where there were no professional resident opera companies anywhere in 1878 when Carmen arrived in the United States. Challenges are certainly presented by the unevenness of our database's information density. But even with a perfect dataset, there is still fundamental difficulty in presenting the temporal nature of the information we need the map to convey. Throughout our examples of locations at which multiple non-continuous runs of Carmen were performed at various times, we quickly settled on the broad solution of utilising a timeline in tandem with the map. The dashes which figure on the timeline below the map that you saw earlier were an attempt by our creative digital designer R.J. Ramey of Alt Studio in California to convey concurrent events, the gaps between them, the pace at which they appear and disappear, long-running productions beside more ephemeral performance runs, thereby providing an additional dimensional and temporal axis which could not be represented by the map alone. In the conceptualization process, Henry Morgan, my assistant, evoked the central timeline of a digital audio workstation with its various overlapping lines, none fully continuous, some more fleeting than others, and each with its own timbre, character, and density. The integration of this timeline with the map is thus designed to provide more than two dimensions to the user, allowing movement through the data in a way that takes at least some advantage of the endless possibilities afforded to us by multidimensional digital space. As music scholars, we are perhaps more aware than most of the particularities of the temporal dimension. Cardiff sociologist Barbara Adam created a typology of time which reflects the features of music: tempo, duration, articulation, sequence, and as musicians we are familiar with the different ways in which these aspects can be represented visually, separated, chopped up and looped. Another allusion to music in the creation of the map and timeline is that of overlap. Music rarely consists of single isolated lines and flows, and this is no more the case for our Carmen data, as multiple stories are told simultaneously, weaving in and out of one another, just as in a musical texture. While these comparisons may appear obvious and even trite, they nevertheless informed our thinking and aided us in our attempts to provide the best visual representation of these extra-dimensional features. But in the same way that the cultural and geopolitical affordances of ready-made digital maps can trap us, so can these musical considerations. When attempting to visualize such multifaceted data in an intuitive, comprehensible way, how can we avoid appealing to our proclivities towards concepts of harmony, form, and conflict versus resolution? As Louis Epstein's online mapping project musicalgeography.org has posited, the making of smaller, detail-specific maps which analyse a subset of data or performances serves as a pendant to the global map and timeline to make different kinds of arguments and create different types of resources. Rather than extracting, say, the 1880-81 Maurice Grau tour of Spanish America from the global map, in my own research I have created other maps in order to visualise certain trends. As alluded to earlier, there were multiple factors which brought Carmen back to Paris in 1883. My impression from research and the one or two letters which survive in archives implied that the touring activities of Célestine Gallimarié between 1878 and 1882 were instrumental in developing the reputation of the opera on French and Italian soil. I thus traced Gallimarié's performances of Carmen from the time she ended the first run in Paris in February 1876 until her reprise of the role in the same theatre on the 27th of October 1883. I had noted that apart from the sedentary longer runs of performances in Geneva in April 1880 and at the Casino in Boulogne-sur-Mer during the summer of 1878, alongside incursions into Italy where she gave performances in Italian, and the one brief tour of a French production to Barcelona, Gallimarié also turned up in Marseille, Toulouse, Bordeaux, Dieppe, Lyon and Liège for a brief series of guest performances. When jetting in for these performances, Gallimarié invariably sang the same repertoire: Gounod's Saint-Marc, Thomas' Mignon, Maillard's Les Dragons de Villars, and Bizet's Carmen. In the regional press, critics often judge Gallimarié's interpretation as superior to that of the local singer, although they do start to remark a deterioration in the quality of her voice, and it is clear that it was her histrionic rather than her vocal talents that made her such a remarkable Carmen. When Adèle Isaac, here likely in the role of Ophélie, was cast in Paris for the first opera comique revival in April 1883, the librettist and cousin of Bizet's widow Ludovic Halévy wrote to Geneviève saying that the revival would be more than just that it would be an admirable first performance, for in 1875 the work in effect was not sung in Paris, and it will be this time. Gallimarié was a character actress of declining vocal talent, and for Halévy she was not the singer he wanted in the role. So once again, back to maps and Louis Epstein's idea of using maps to tell specific stories. I tried to visualise Gallimarié's touring efforts in a static map, but one nevertheless drawn from the interactive data on the website. Here I wanted also to be able to show on the map some sort of progression or flow without the use of the timeline, resorting thus to a sliding scale of colour. The physical area of Gallimarié's touring activities demonstrate, no doubt, what sort of singer she was, her reputation and the touring circuits for singers of her calibre, no doubt aided and abetted in Italy, where she was the first to sing Carmen, by the impresario and Italian publisher of the score, Edoardo Sonzogno, about whom and his activities we still do not know enough. Despite Sonzogno's hiring of French singers for the role, the Italians were not enamoured of such French singing actresses, seemingly preferring those schooled in the bel canto tradition in the fully sung version of the opera. Yet this visualisation helped me realise another important point as I tried to establish how the opera's reputation was made in regional France, and that includes Walloon Belgium, Brussels and Romandy Switzerland, at precisely the same time as its international reputation. The latter was of course reported in the Parisian press, but it was in the French regional press that Carmen's reputation was to be won or lost, as far as the French and thus Parisian destiny of Carmen was concerned. Marseille reviews of Gallimardier's performances from April 1878 are perched on the brink of the turning tide with critical success of Carmen in France, even if circumstances did not bring the work back to Paris until 1883. The Marseille reviews came in the immediate wake of successful performances in Stockholm and rather more mediocre performances in Italian in St. Petersburg. They immediately precede those in Italian in Britain and across the Atlantic with Minnie Hawke in the title role, which sealed the opera's bankability for all time. Thus, in many ways, the Marseille reviews demonstrate the extent to which the fate of Carmen was already predicated on French and Belgian success, which Gallimarie actively built upon with her touring activities even before the opera's translation into Italian. The fact that Gallimarie did not stray far beyond a restricted perimeter, a fact clearly brought home by its visualisation on my map, a perimeter only just beyond the physical borders of France, shows therefore how instrumental she was in the making of the reputation of Bizet's opera in France and of bringing it home to Paris in 1883. When the news of Gallimarie's return to the Opéra Comique reached the ears of Geneviève Bizet in October 1883, she was astounded. And when she took up the role again in the autumn of 1885, Geneviève wrote from Italy to Ludovic, and I quote, "I read in the French papers that Galli is opening her season in Carmen, which surprised me somewhat, but not that much. I think, like you, that the public is not ready for a young Carmen. It is used to this old lady of talent, and they should have her." Historical performances not only take place, but are intimately tied to specific physical spaces, in our case, theatres, where each place in time is a unique configuration of power and people who share lived experiences with the political, social, industrial, artistic and natural worlds around them. While many of these theatres remain standing today, either in their original state or on the same site, a significant number no longer exist in cityscapes that have been thoroughly modified, some so much that the original dress of the theatre, if we know it, can no longer be localised. Moreover, we are dealing with whole countries that no longer exist, or which during different periods of their history were annexed or partitioned to different sovereign states. The attraction to overlay GIS and Google with historical maps is therefore enticing, to be able to reflect geopolitical changes and create a map on which performance runs are able to cross real-time borders, however much disruption this may cause for the user. Our solution in the end was more neutral, but of course it can in no way show, for instance, the close correspondences between performances in Krakow in Poland and those in Lviv in modern-day Ukraine, 70 kilometres from the Polish border, which were once part of the same Austro-Hungarian partition of Poland. Nevertheless, the digital map offers us possibility of representing and analysing change over time in both minute detail and vast breadth. In relation to flow maps, Thomas Sutherland refers, however, to a move away from the representation of space towards the spatialisation of time. This is perhaps the notion that has posed us the greatest challenge in our project, which not only spatialises time, but very literally theatricalises time. Barbara Adams' timing, tempo, duration, and sequence, placing these concepts centre stage as we try to reimagine how we might visualise them in relation to an operatic production over a 70-year time frame within the digital media of a map. I hope my experiences of mapping in all its figurative, metaphorical wayfaring and performative guises may have been useful to you. From historical GIS to musical cartography, from popular music heritage and the characterisation of place along ethnic and racial lines, to approaches to psychogeography, the deep mapping and cartography undertaken by musicologists and ethnomusicologists today irrevocably forms part of what we do in the spatial humanities. Such projects speak to a rich profusion of perspectives that are, in some shape or form, engaged with the mapping, tapping, and emplotment of a layered and multifaceted sense of place, narrative, history, and memory. CarmenAbroad.org aims to provide a historical tool that is effective and immersive, one that can suggest spatial temporal narratives, and through visual design, embodied navigation and curatorial strategies offer a new articulation and investigation of and engagement with cultural and operatic history. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to talking to you tomorrow on Zoom. Thanks. Bye-bye.